right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. My name is Laura and my pronouns are she and hers. I'm a member of the event organizing team and the moderator for this session. I want to make you all aware that if you go to the bottom menu at the bottom of your bar on Zoom, there is a transcription available. You can click the button at the bottom of the menu that says subtitles. And then in dreaming of this event, our team was inspired by words adapted from Project NIA. Abolitionist futures are not compatible with white supremacy, settler colonialism, misogyny, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, and classism. Yet these systems of oppression are all around us and affect even this event space. So the hope our team has for this session is that organizers, presenters, and participants, particularly those of us who carry a lot of privilege, are mindful of the differential impacts of power and have the courage to hold to account anyone here who exercises power in ways that enact harm. If one of our organizers does remove you from this session, our intention is not to punish nor to exclude you, but to practice care for the abolitionist community we are building. We will have our presenters speak, and then afterwards we will have a Q&A, so please hold on to any of your questions that you have. You can write them in the chat and we will try to address as many as we can. So to start, I would like to welcome Matt Clement. He lectures at Criminology at the University of Winchester, UK, and he has recently written about state violence, social movements, and strategies of tension for critical criminology, social justice, and the European Journal of Criminology. His influences are Marxism and the sociology of Norbert Elias. Matt also wrote A History of Riots, Protests, and the Law, The Sound of the Crowd. I'm very pleased to introduce you.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, that's right. I think one of the things that did make me want to look at this whole question about the role of the police and whether we should just be looking at reform or whether we had to go as far as abolition was the fact that I'd done this monograph looking at the history of protest, because it was quite clear that by looking at the history of people struggling to improve their lot, and they've always come up against the forces of social control. The police may be the latest version of the forces of social control that try to exercise the monopoly of the status quo for the last couple of hundred years, certainly in Britain and America for that matter, slightly shorter period in other countries. And of course, there are still many countries at the moment that are relying upon the military to exercise the social control in the day-to-day. Most horrifically, of course, currently in Myanmar, but the record is really long over the last few years of military interventions, violent interventions by the forces of social control, by social control agents. And I don't think most people in those countries would have much problem with saying that they needed to abolish, do away with these violent forces that are perpetuating their oppression. And I think it is the case that we should see that also when we look at the police, because in reality, to start with, the police is a force, police violence is a force that's authorized by law, takes various interconnected forms, and is routine and commonplace, occurs every day in different forms. When you think about institutional racism, of course, there's the violence on the streets, there's the action by the errant officer, there's the violence, the stop and frisk, and of course the killings. But there's also the routine violence of institutional violence that occurs through so many other social policies that perpetuate inequality and violence in variegated forms. And of course, it's targeted, as people have highlighted in the introduction, along the lines of race, class, and gender. So really what we're saying is that, you know, it's police violence that constitutes and produces our political and economic and social order that are kind of oversees that. So it's absolutely central to the key political problems that we face today. And of course, that was massively reinforced to us just a year ago now, wasn't it, with the the enormous resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement following George Floyd's death. And of course, we've been graphically reminded even this week, even in the last couple of days, by yet another unforgivable police action in Minneapolis that has just sparked, in the midst of the trial, all of the old agonies once again. And of course, it's been a tremendously empowering movement. You know, on the one hand, you know, we're horrified by the police violence and the way that they behave. But on the other hand, we are inspired by the resistance that it has pushed through, that it's pushed forward. You know, you'll all know the figures of the 26 million people that the New York Times reported have been involved in Black Lives Matter movement activism by about the beginning of September of this year. So more have been added since, no doubt. Hardly a significant town or city that has not been affected by Black Lives Matter movements in the States. And of course, we've seen it happening in Paris, we've seen it happen in Brazil, we've seen it happen in all sorts of countries, demonstrations and actions in support of this movement and along the same lines, and recognizing similar temporalities to it. And certainly in Britain, we saw a great big surge of the Black Lives Matter movement occurring last summer in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And of course, it's because people can see the echoes from over there, over here, so that people were holding up slogans on the protests we had in Southampton, for example, where I live, UK not innocent, naming the people who've been victims of police violence, of which there are many hundreds in Britain. And as you can imagine, just like in America, very, very few police officers ever face sanctions of any sort over it. So this whole question has been a very pertinent one in Britain as well. So much so that actually last summer I decided to try and put a new publication together around this, which is actually going to be called No Justice, No Police, ? The politics of protest and the politics of politics and the protest of social change. So what we're trying to do is put together the two factors and say you cannot understand the police without understanding protest. You cannot understand protest without understanding the policing mechanisms that tend to accompany every time a protest action occurs, because the two are indissolubly connected, and one can only be understood in terms of the other. So in that sense, it's very important to put them together in that way. And of course, like I said, we have been seeing this global wave of struggle going on recently. I mean, just to pull out a couple of examples, I talked about Myanmar. You know, I think it's nearly 500 people have been killed now by the military since the military coup that occurred in December, annulling the elections that had just voted in Aung San Suu Kyi's party in majority rule. So they've been repressed, and the opposition to the military repression has carried on heroically ever since, with general strikes, with coordination on the streets, with special organization on social media, etc., to try and make sure that in every town and city in Myanmar, the resistance continues and still carries on. And of course, that carries on in the tradition of so many other countries that have also faced police outrages and revolted in their stead. Places like Chile and Bolivia in 2019, Hong Kong through 2019 and 2020, Sudan, Algeria, Nigeria, Thailand, all occurring last year. And really, the police have been absolutely central to these. I'm just going to highlight an example from Belarus, where you saw big protests in the summer of last year. What happened basically is that the president won the election, surprise, surprise, with 90% of the vote. When the crowds came out onto the streets of the capital and all the big towns in Belarus to protest against this rigged result, which was clearly untrue, the police steamed in. They were Lukashenko, the candidate's private army, essentially. They arrested 7,000 people, they assaulted 200, they killed and tortured 3 just on that first night. Protests grew. They were torturing people in the police stations. There was a notorious example just a few days later in a town in western Belarus, where an ambulance had arrived and people were injured, so that the people who weren't injured were carrying badly injured people towards the ambulance because they desperately wanted to get them some help, only for the doors of the ambulance to fly open and riot police to jump out and start beating up protesters. In other words, they'd even deliberately sent a fake ambulance in to organize the violence that they were intending to carry out and reinforce their oppressive code. So all over the globe at the moment, we are seeing these vicious police actions, and they're all really fuel to the fire for the idea that reforming this organization is just a utopian dream, that it needs to be a more fundamental form of change, of a very deep reform, a reform that goes so deep that I think abolition is a realistic description of the type of change that is needed for it to actually happen. But certainly it will need a massive social movement demanding that change to have a chance of it being implemented. So why are the police playing this role so fundamentally? Well, I mean, lots of criminologists have talked about it. I'll quote from one, Audrey Farrell, who wrote a book called Crime, Class and Corruption. And she said, basically, it's about the police's relationship with the system. The police are on hand, she writes, to make sure that the wealth stays with the wealthy. The police therefore have the job of defending the very system that generates crime. Little wonder that they can do little to stop it, she says. You know, if we ever want to wonder why the police's record is so appalling on clearing up crimes, etc., it's because it's not really the job they're employed to do. They are employed to maintain social control. And of course, because it's about maintaining the wealth of the very few, the 1%, by making sure that the 99% do not feel confident to challenge the rampant inequality within their society, then as Farrell argues, they're defending the very system that itself is criminal. We're talking about, as Valeria Vague-Weiss in her book Marxism and Criminology has described it, the over-criminalization of the poor and the under-criminalization of the rich. So the crimes of the rich are not criminalized in any meaningful sense of the word because of their control of power in society. And so their crimes are sanctioned, their violence is sanctioned, their robbery of resources and land is sanctioned. And at the same time, when people resist this robbery, try and fight this injustice, then of course they are over-criminalized by these forces. And many criminologists, even quite mainstream ones, recognize some aspects of these fundamental problems in policing. It's just that they don't follow them through to their full conclusion. So Rob Reiner, a fairly mainstream criminologist, to be honest, who did write a pretty good book called The Politics of the Police. And he points out, again, aspects of their job which essentially mean that they're going to behave in ways that the population are going to find unacceptable. For example, what is policing? He says policing tasks arise in emergencies, usually ones with at least an element of social conflict. And therefore, the police may invoke their legal powers to handle the situation, but more commonly, they react in a variety of ways and means to keep the peace without initiating legal proceedings. Well, that's just a polite way of saying they don't use the law. Most policing isn't anything to do with being lawful. They act like a gang. They use their force. They use their mandate, their license to kill or their license to intimidate, and they bully, and that's how they actually control. That's how they police the streets. That's how they so-called keep the peace. And that's essentially the format that police operate with it most of the time. So it's no wonder that they become inured to violence and become kind of neutral on this kind of prospect. Don't neutralize. They don't even realize this degree of damage that they're doing half the time, which is why often we seem to have the scenario where, you know, the police genuinely seem to imagine that they're under attack when it's they themselves that are doing the attacking. So often you have this situation, don't you, where a situation where the police are attacking innocent people, but somehow they think that they're doing it because they're under attack. The Black Lives Matter killings are a perfect example of this, you know, and even in the riots that we had in the UK in 2011, this was how the police did it. And how they saw it. The police didn't enjoy or didn't claim to enjoy inflicting violence on the streets, but they claimed that they genuinely felt fear at the prospect of the riots that were going on around them. But in fact, I would call this victim-perpetrator reversal. It's a bit like Donald Trump when he talked about the fear that he felt about an invasion by the Mexicans, etc., etc. It's actually a victim-perpetrator reversal. Trump was really the one dealing out the violence, Trump and his state forces. And the powerless people were the ones who were feeling his oppression. But he reversed that notion of who was the victim and who was the perpetrator in order to present himself as an injured party. And this is something that the police do too. They are fearful of the danger that the public are liable to put them in. And again, we have seen examples of this happening in Britain just over the last couple of months, where we've seen particular examples of police violence occurring. What has happened is a woman has been killed, Sarah Everard, and a serving police officer of the London Police Force, the Metropolitan Police, has been arrested and charged with her murder. But when women wanted to protest, not just women, but women and men that supported women in this situation, wanted to protest and have a vigil for Sarah Everard to protest about what had happened, not an explicitly anti-police action, in fact, but simply a vigil to mourn another victim of violence and to point to the fact that crimes of violence against women are not dealt with properly by the criminal justice system. The first action of the police was to say that this was banned because of the COVID pandemic, that it wouldn't be safe to allow this vigil to take place. Well, it took place anyway, and when it did, the police came in quite brutally. So brutally, in fact, that even at the time, the Prime Minister spoke up saying he was concerned at some of the images of the police actions that he'd seen at that night on the vigil, because he'd seen women being restrained by being forced onto the ground, handcuffed and forced onto the ground, held down there by multiple police officers in ways that were very, very concerning. Though, surprise, surprise, the government since launched an inquiry into all of this and vindicated the police's actions, as always seems to happen whenever there is an official inquiry into police behaviour. So essentially,
I would like to give a 5-minute time.
Sorry?
Check. I would like to give a 5-minute time check.
5 minutes, that's fine. Thank you very much. So essentially what we're looking at in this situation is, contemporary attempts to reform the police are failing. They're failing in Britain, they're failing in America, they're failing around the world. As Rachel Hertzing put it in her address to the Critical Prison Studies Caucus, contemporary efforts at reforming the police are simply not working. Despite efforts at diverse hiring, implicit bias training, civilian review boards, and criminal indictments of the police, violence remained a core feature of that sprawling institution. In fact, she was quoted as saying, "The only way to stop the violence of policing is to make the cops obsolete." And essentially, more and more people are drawing that conclusion. In Britain, like I said, the protests and the oppression, the oppressive policing that the women and their supporters experienced at the hands of the police led to an incentive to really focus protest at this new police crime and sentencing bill that the government is trying to introduce, and which is going to basically make it illegal to carry out peaceful protests. They're actually talking about declaring that any peaceful protest can be called a, quote, public nuisance if one member of the public complains about it. They want to introduce something where they can say that there are noise levels that are unacceptable on public peaceful protests, and therefore anybody using a megaphone or shouting out, that could be enough noise to justify the police steaming in and arresting people. And just to ensure that people got the message, that bill has been pushed through literally on the days following the protests for Sarah Everard, and that's been followed by several kill the bill demonstrations in cities up and down the UK. Lots of groups of people, women, Black Lives Matter supporters, traveller supporters, because they also want to crank down as part of this bill on something they call unauthorised encampments. So it does mean that travellers and gypsies will also face the wrath of the law, and also homeless people. Anybody, in fact, who's threatening to use the streets in any kind of way just to live on will face much tougher periods of policing if this bill is allowed to be pushed through. And so people really feel that they have no choice but to protest. And it's really a virtuous or a vicious cycle, depending on which way you look at it. It's a vicious cycle in the sense that, you know, people who are protesting are being persecuted for it. So for the very act of asserting your human rights and your civil rights, you will face further persecution. But it's a virtuous circle in the sense that oppressive policing, of course, is making more people protest. It's making people realize there's nowhere for them to go but to protest. And therefore, they are getting out onto the streets. They are recognizing solidarities with other groups and oppressions going on with other groups. And there's no doubt that one of the main cities that is focused, and I'll finish on this, that there's been the focus of a lot of these protests has been Bristol. And that was partly because on a Black Lives Matter protest of 10,000 people in Bristol last summer, they pulled down the statue of Edward Colston, a famous slave trader of that city. They rolled the statue all the way down the main high street and dumped it in the city dock. It was a brilliant action to kind of link up oppression, past and present, of Black people and kind of say Black Lives Matter now and Black Lives Mattered hundreds of years ago. And we should not be glorifying the slave trade. And of course, it horrified the establishment here in Britain. The Home Secretary, who's the person in charge of the police in Britain, she actually has called the Black Lives Matters protesters disgusting. And she said that anybody damaging statues or war memorials could face a 10-year sentence. And this is really angered people who want to protest, because they've said, you know, the maximum people are likely to get for rape, for example, in Britain, would be a 5-year sentence. And yet you're proposing an up to 10-year sentence for damaging an inanimate object like a statue. And indeed, in the case of a slave trader statue, a statue that should have come down anyhow. So really what I'm saying is the abolition movement, the movement to abolish the police and defund the police, the strength of that movement is growing all around the world now as the cycle of protest is continuing, partly because authority is so determined to keep cracking down, and therefore abolition is becoming an ever more urgent demand. And I'll leave it there.
Ryan is a doctoral candidate in criminology and criminal justice at Old Dominion University. He earned his master's and bachelor's at Eastern Kentucky University. His primary areas of study are Marxist criminology and critical prison studies, with a specific focus on the role ideology plays in legitimizing the carceral state. Welcome, Ryan.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Laura. So let me just take a second to get my PowerPoint pulled up here. Okay, so yeah, I am Ryan Phillips, and I would like to say that I am currently on the unceded territory of the Chesapeake and Lumbee peoples, and so I would like to acknowledge that before I start. So, but my paper that I'm presenting is actually something I've been working on for about the past year or so with two of my colleagues, Drs. Brian Pitman and Stephen Young, and it's called Violent Symbiosis, Criminology and Criminal Justice's Role in Legitimizing Racialized Police Violence. So myself and my colleagues were criminologists, so we've been paying attention, of course, to calls like the one you see here in the slide for criminology and sociology departments to divest from the relationships that they have with police. And most places do have some sort of type of working relationship with policing departments. And these calls, of course, have been going on for quite a long time. There's a long history of it, but there has definitely been more of a focus on it, especially in terms of a lot of it's come out in the media, and there have been articles by Truthout and others focusing on it in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. And especially when it was revealed that two of the officers who killed George Floyd were educated at the University of Minnesota. So our paper focuses not on those calls, but what those calls themselves are focusing on, which is The academic discipline of criminology and criminal justice, or what I'm going to call CCJ for the rest of the presentation, CCJ's ties to policing and imperialism, specifically in the US context. So we begin from the idea that CCJ acts as a tool of legitimacy for policing. It doesn't call into question the nature of policing itself as an institution, but instead helps to give it ideological cover, especially in times of crisis, sort of like the crisis of legitimacy that the institution has sort of faced lately, especially over the past year. So we proceed by outlining the historical context of CCJ and its role as a tool of police legitimacy, with the purpose of illuminating the magnitude of mainstream CCJ's harm in supporting racialized state violence. So we briefly go over the racist history of US policing in our paper, but I won't really revisit that here. I'm sure we all are at least vaguely familiar with that. And then we go on to talk about the history of CCJ in the US. So American CCJ begins with a guy named August Vollmer. You may have heard of him before. He's also considered the father of policing in the United States. So Vollmer was in the military at the time of the Spanish-American War, which was, of course, a war of imperialist aggression carried out by the US for a territorial conquest. And it was during his time there, especially during when he was part of the military occupation of the city of Manila in the Philippines, that he was exposed to various policing and counterinsurgency tactics. Vollmer later reflected on how the tactics he learned during the war influenced his development for policing tactics when he said, quote, "For years, I've studied military tactics and used them in rounding up crooks. After all, we're conducting a war against the enemies of society, and we must never forget that." And so what that quotation demonstrates is something that we've heard a lot about lately, which is this thing called police militarization. And people act like that's sort of a recent thing. It's really not. Police militarization is an ongoing project that's been ongoing really ever since policing has been a thing. The two are inextricably bound up. So after he was in the military, Vollmer served as the police chief in Berkeley, California. Served as the police chief in Berkeley, California. And it was here, while he was there, that he created the first CCJ program at the University of California, Berkeley in 1916. And it was rooted in him advocating for a more professionalized, and professionalized in quotations, of course, and science-based policing under the guidance and control of the police department. Vollmer was inspired by the Army's new techniques, utilizing alpha and beta tests for soldiers to test police officers, and declaring one of the key components of his policing courses to be military science. His militarized program spread throughout the US, oftentimes with Vollmer going to and consulting in person, and gained support from reformists who wanted to see the police trained like soldiers in the military. Now, under his regime, the Berkeley and LA police departments established various initiatives, including the creation of military-style intelligence units. Vollmer was also instrumental in the ideology and technology of an early form of hotspots policing when he was LA police chief. And he used an early form of the computer to identify locations with high crime and placed officers there to try to deter future crimes. He also helped develop the polygraph, as well as other, what I would consider pseudoscientific techniques, handwriting and fingerprinting analysis. In terms of CCJ education, Vollmer mandated that his students take classes that taught racist biological connections to criminality. A lot of those racist theories were really popular at the time, so like phrenology, things like that. And classes basically that taught eugenics. So in order to make sure that he always had enough students for his eugenics courses, Vollmer created a junior police program, youth program that used military tactics to train future police. He was also behind the push for the creation of CCJ scholarly journals, and he pressured his subordinates to publish their research in them. The model of CCJ education that Vollmer started was soon exported throughout the country to other universities. Vollmer had quite a few followers who expanded his CCJ courses, to various other locations, ranging from Harvard all the way over to the University of Hawaii. In 1941, he hosted the first meeting of the National Association of Police Training Officials. The association was developed quote, for the purpose of gathering future college police training and standardizing police training curricula. That organization expanded and eventually became what's called the American Society of Criminology. Over time, Vollmer's followers sort of split off from the American Society of Criminology to create what's called now the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and those two professional organizations are the main sort of governing academic bodies in criminology today. In the 1960s, CCJ rapidly expanded, mostly due to an influx of funding from the federal government. So with help from a Ford Foundation grant, the International Association of Chiefs of Police began to employ full-time staff for the sole purpose of generating interest in developing policing programs at community colleges and universities. And then in 1968, you had, of course, the Omnibus Bill that was passed, and it was really important for CCJ's expansion because the bill established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. It incentivized academic research around the testing of criminal legal responses through the creation of what would become the National Institute of Justice, or NIJ. The legalization and development of the NIJ tied CCJ programs to the professionalization of policing and focused research on pro-policing strategies through additional grant funding. The LEAA instituted the Law Enforcement Education Program, or LEAP, which allocated over $200 million for police and other policing agents to earn any degree as long as it was related to CCJ. LEAP quickly gained popularity among higher education institutions as CCJ programs developed across the country. Now, importantly, the impetus for this funding and for the Omnibus Bill just in general was to increase state control in the face of anti-war protest and the civil rights movement generally. So CCJ's expansion and funding was directly tied to countering civil rights and unrest. And so essentially CCJ expanded and became what we know it today as a form of counterinsurgency. So hang on just a second. Okay. As CCJ departments grew, LEA cohorts began relying increasingly on government crime to produce quantitative ahistorical research. This contributed to a decreased interest in researching structural factors like poverty and race, and an increased focus on pro-policing strategies like deterrence. CCJ theory increasingly focused more on the individual level, while centering policy on the ideals of punishment. And of course, CCJ becoming more reliant on government data created a power dynamic where it's harder for CCJ scholars to criticize, to bite the hand that feeds them, so to speak. There are a couple instances that we mentioned in the paper where criminological researchers have actually been reprimanded by their own departments for being too critical of the criminal legal system and policing. One of the main deterrence-focused pro-policing theories to come out of criminology was broken windows theory, which has probably been the most reactionary and harmful perspective to come from academic CCJ. Broken windows was at the height of its popularity in the 80s and 90s when police departments across the country implemented tactics to support its theoretical underpinnings. Though CCJ has mostly moved away from broken windows theory, the implications of many other popular crim theories, such as routine activities and rational choice theories, call in their policy implications for broken window style policing, which targets Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, BIPOC communities, for increased police contact and oppression. Thus, a plausible implication of broken windows tactics is the increased police murders within such communities. In 1994, another major crime bill was passed, and it was in large part built on the theoretical implications of broken windows and the many deterrence-focused theories that CCJ was putting out at the time. One of the most significant aspects of the 94 bill was that it established the Community-Oriented Policing Services, or COPS, and designated $14 billion in funding for community policing. COPS was also important in the rise of racist programs such as CompStat in New York City and the Chicago Alternative Policing Strategy. These, heavily based on the theoretical assumptions of mainstream criminology, along with other programs, were instrumental in the expansion of the police state and policing in general in the U.S. CCJ still generally supports the ideology of broken windows and community policing. Broken windows policing, of course, still continues in places like New York City. It's across the country, but particularly has been harmful in New York City. For instance, the New York City's Metropolitan Transit Authority, or MTA, escalated civil summons for fare evasion on the subway starting in 2019. New York State also pledged to hire 400 more MTA officers at the cost of $260 million to try to police the subway and to police quality of life offenses in and around the subway, particularly fare evasion. And of course, that's heavily racialized, as 90% of people arrested for fare evasion from April to June of 2019 were Black or Latinx. Finally, during the ongoing COVID-19 epidemic, police were enlisted to patrol for those breaking social distancing guidelines. This resulted in the disproportionate summons and arrest of BIPOC.
Ryan, I'm giving you a verbal time check.
Gotcha. CCJ continues to bolster police legitimacy by utilizing predictive research-based policies and shielding their racialized practices as data-driven, despite research demonstrating the racism of these community policing techniques. Instead of questioning the existence of policing, mainstream criminologists in the last 7 to 8 years have focused more attention on the impact of reformist measures like body-worn cameras or BWCs. There have been at least 70 studies on BWCs that we could find for the paper. There might be more, and most of them have been conducted since 2013. Assessing BWCs simply deflects attention away from policing as an institution. Instead, the focus tends to be on the one bad apple or one bad cop approach, and the thinking is that BWCs can help prevent unjustified killings instead of realizing that policing itself is a violent institution. In the aftermath of Ferguson, CCJ scholars also responded to the St. Louis police chief, who coined the term Ferguson effect, which is the hypothesis that violent crime is increasing because police are no longer being proactive. This bad faith argument was picked up by some CCJ researchers, such as the article you can see there from Justice Corley, which is one of the major CCJ journals. And it demonstrates the willingness of some in the discipline to provide lip service to distracting research and reformists rather than actually holding policing accountable. So to wrap up, CCJ's ahistorical approach toward the violence of policing perpetuates the denial of the lived experiences of BIPOC. The rising popularity of micro-level criminological theories, coupled with the consequential policy responses, are reflective of the shift in the socio-economic relations in the U.S. since the late 1960s. The transition in CCJ research occurred despite a lot of other research, particularly in sociology, that consistently disputes and rejects biological and individual responsibility theoretical frameworks that are often conservative in nature. While BIPOC scholars who are in CCJ continue to produce research demonstrating the racial violence of policing, orthodox CCJ's defiance of this criticism and continued reliance on the above frameworks reinforces the symbiotic relationship between it and the state. Through its programming and research, the discipline provides academic credence to violent state policies, while the state continues to recruit for and from CCJ programs, thus expanding the power and reach of policing. CCJ's purpose is to ensure the legitimacy of policing, which exists to enforce the racialized status quo and to suppress dissent. It does this by advocating for reformist reforms, focusing on orthodox or mainstream research, and relying on state funding that distracts from policing's connections to violence within BIPOC communities. Additionally, CCJ scholars directly fuel racist and violent sentiments toward these communities by putting forth notions that BIPOC are disrespectful during encounters with the police and act in a manner that justifies racial profiling. Some scholars, and I use that term loosely, like James Q. Wilson, who was one of the progenitors of broken windows, believe racism is the consequence of the disproportionate crimes of BIPOC, which completely absolves the racist criminal legal system and policymaking. The existence of this logic and other logics within CCJ means that it is complicit in the perpetuation of oppression and in the erasure of the number of people police kill every year. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much to all of our presenters, bringing up a lot of really fascinating ideas and giving us a lot to think about. We are now moving into our conversation section, which we hope to really be a conversation. If you have any questions, you can either place them in the chat for me to read or just place your name and we can unmute you to ask it verbally. I also will be attaching a link to our feedback form for both of our for participants and presenters to give feedback at any time.
I guess before we sort of get some questions, I wanted to ask if any of, can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, it's
I
a little.
wanted to ask if the panelists would want to stage some interventions for each other, having heard each other's sort of presentation. I do have additional questions, but I just wanted to sort of create a conversation among yourselves.
Can the chair rephrase the question a little bit? I must admit I couldn't hear it too clearly.
I'm just asking if there are some interventions you want to stage for each other, aspects of each other's presentation you want to engage in. We can allow a couple of minutes.
Okay. Okay.
I have a question maybe for Matt. Something like this isn't my, I didn't present on my thesis work. I'm actually researching Germanic neo-paganism and right-wing extremist terrorism. And one of the things that I find interesting is that, you know, attacks against hegemonic identities are classified as terrorism, and attacks against subcultural identities are classified as hate crime, right? Generally speaking. One of the things that protest does is protest is one of the first things that leads to revolution, and terrorism is simply someone else's revolution, right? So I was just wondering if you could sort of comment on the relationship between mass mobilization and protest movements and the political, you know, the political mobilization of what we call terrorist movements, and how they relate to one another and how they are dissimilar. Because I think they get confused conceptually by the state when they respond, because the state doesn't really understand it's enforcing its own hegemony.
Yeah, I think you're being quite charitable when you say the state doesn't really understand. The state chooses not to understand deliberately to muddy the waters. As you know, in Britain, we came up with a brilliant method of dealing with these dangers, which is called the prevent strategy, which I know has been so badly received in the rest of the world that even America is saying they won't do it, which is, you know, it's impressive for us to be worse than the States when it comes to punitive policy. But basically, it says that radicalization is a form of, you know, to become radicalized is to basically become a terrorist or become the raw material for future terrorism, and there to justify any sort of levels of suppression of you. Now, clearly, you know, it doesn't take a genius to work out that, you know, hey, loads of us are radical. And if being a radical it criminalizes you that severely, it has very, very serious implications. And therefore, it is a question of the state deliberately criminalizing. You know, they've gone from criminalizing acts to criminalizing the potential for acts to criminalizing the sort of people that they choose to stereotype as believing might be carrying out these acts. But all of these actions of criminalization are very, very dangerous. And of course, also they kind of produce what we've called double binds. You know, they're kind of the self-fulfilling prophecies. You know, if you think about the case, for example, of people who joined ISIS, people who traveled from other countries to join ISIS in the last few years, you know, that the Muslim community had been so demonized by the mass media that it fed into those people who wanted to sell a particular brand of of Islam that justified the ISIS position. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, the prevent legislation, rather than actually preventing, was actually facilitating people moving in that violent direction. But I think more generally, also, it just will allow them to try and criminalize protest. And the fact that they want to criminalize protest in Britain in the particular way they're saying at the moment, peaceful protest, it's very much against our human rights. But it's also, it seems to me, incredibly foolish by the authorities, because they give us nowhere else to go but to accelerate and amplify our protest. You know, it's a deviancy amplification spiral. It's a classic, as Stuart Hall would call it.
I was as a Canadian, I found it when the January 6th attack on the Capitol happened in the United States. For me, that was very interesting, because it was a sitting president, right? And the people who attacked were considered to be in the sort of narrative mix that we have now, are terrorists. But it was ambiguous at first, because it was, are they going to be protesters or are they going to be terrorists, right? The extremists, or the people who share their opinions, believe they were protesting even when they used violence. And then the other side believes they are terrorists because they were trying to remove a governance structure by force and not by democracy. So that's what I was sort of thinking of, because to me, that was completely, it was a tipping point that could go any direction. And that's why that's why that day was so fraught, because the categorizations and the narratives could swing in any direction, at least from a perspective of a foreigner. Once I found out how the American military actually related to the executive office and how they were responding to them, I realized that it couldn't happen. But before that, it seemed like it could go either direction: terrorism or protest, revolution or stability. And I just think that is interesting. And I was wondering if anybody else has a comment, because that's where all of our topics sort of intersect, right?
I think they do. I mean, I think, you know, it's on the one hand, you have a group that all sorts of so-called objective definitions of terrorism would say are terrorist. But of course, they've just been encouraged to go down the road by the actual serving president of the country at the time. So no wonder they can feel, you know, sanctioned and authorized in their actions that they took. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you know, the ambiguous attitude of, you know, the police and indeed the secret services and indeed members of the military to the protesters, you know, was quite amazing, wasn't it? I mean, after the protest, we have what, 20,000 people in Washington, you know, 20,000 troops. You can't move for them. I saw the inauguration ceremony, absolutely incredible level of militarization. But when they were protesting, you know, the only military to be seen were probably people on the protest with the far right, and you know, literally the few Capitol Police that were there were outnumbered by the scale of protests. So it was a calamitous situation in all sorts of ways, and it does make you wonder where it's going to end. I mean, I argued that it was an example of the strategy of tension, really, where some elements of the state are on the side of undermining the actually existing state in order to try and discredit it. You know, clearly Trump, but many other people besides him, I would say.
We do only have a few minutes left. There is a question that is directed for Ryan, if you see that in the chat.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, I see it. Yeah, it's a really good question from looks like from Daniel. In terms of what role, you know, abolition or should just try to rework CCJ departments, I think CCJ itself needs to be abolished, and there's actually a really good edited volume that I myself and a few other colleagues have a chapter in that's coming out next year by Vivian Salihana, Jason Williams and Michael Coyle, who and it's actually called Abolish Criminology, and it's a collection of chapters that talk about the urgent need to abolish criminology. And so I would say, for the reasons that I laid out in terms of CCJ's ties to state violence, white supremacy, imperialism, all of that, sort of all of the above, that it does need to be abolished. But I think, as you know, I am a criminologist. I am part of the problem in that way, I suppose. But I think as critical criminologists, we just need to sort of do what we can while we can, because, you know, completely getting away from criminology ourselves, that won't abolish it. We have to do the work and work with communities and teach students. You know, I consider it a victory when I have a student who no longer wants to be a cop at the end of the semester. Like that's a good thing. We need to try to get, you know, win the little goals like that, get them to not want to work within the criminal legal system, but try to work out of it. So I think there are things we can do within CCJ, but overall our goal should be to get rid of it. It's no good to anyone, in my opinion. And now I'm joined by my cat.
Sharon, Cheryl, did you have a final question?
I guess I just wanted to thank you all for engaging. I do think there are some spaces for a lot of critique to be to enter into this conversation. There were a couple of things that definitely should not be ignored. I'm not sure. I'll speak with the conference organizers if we can create a way to intervene. And I'm a little nervous around the idea of what was it called? Make justice tribal again. That and I think it goes back to the positionality of the Black and African community, in the sense that kinship formations for us were either never recognized or they were forged by forced breeding, right? And so for someone to sort of even put that sort of a lens as like a way to somewhere positive is like a little bit triggering. So I hope we'll find another space to engage. I also wanted to engage with the Sarah Everhart narrative as well, because I do think that there's a way in which the structural position of the way the military and the prison industrial complex topple onto the Black being is very different from the way it sort of might instrumentalize a few individual white people or non-Black. Obviously, we're out of time, but I really just want to hold some of these tensions, hold some of these conversations, and maybe we will continue in a different way. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I hope everyone will continue to come to our future events. There's one coming up here in just a few minutes, but a round of applause for our presenters, and thank you, everyone.
Okay.